write up mine. We would exchange our ideas, and I would frequently, when I received his, look at it, and then I would say, I believe that the president means to say this. And it would go back to him. He would consider that, very frequently adopting a good deal of what I had suggested, but also putting it in his inimitable, wonderful words, so that it came out flowing quite clearly and for all concerned. And it was issued, of course, always in his name, because that is the way our system operates. All is done on the executive branch of government, in the executive branch, in the name of the president. Whether or not the president, in some cases, knew anything about it. I'm not sure with Mr. Adams that he did, but in the case of Mr. Jefferson, he was pretty well aware. But there was a conversation that went on continuously.
And what time frame was this?
This was from 1801. I arrived in Washington City in May of 1801. Mr. Jefferson, of course, had been inaugurated in early March, but I was unable, through some personal illness and other issues, to get there until early May. And Mrs. Madison and her sister and her son Payne, we all arrived, and we spent a few weeks there in the President's Mansion with Mr. Jefferson until we could find our own lodgings. And then I remained as Secretary of State then until 1809. I think it might be important to know, though, that before that time, I mean, I was the first president to be elected directly from the office of Secretary of State. Mr. Jefferson was elected from the position of being vice president. Mr. Adams before him had been elected from the position of being vice president. But there were two things that happened during Mr. Jefferson's presidency that changed that. The first of which was Aaron Burr, who was...
Maybe you can refresh our audience as to who Aaron Burr might have been.
Well, Aaron Burr was the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, who was a great preacher of the Great Awakening and actually the first president of the College of New Jersey. And I met Aaron, we were students together at the college. And a little later on, when after the first Congress met, it was Aaron Burr that introduced me to Dolly. So he had some importance
How did
in my
Mr.
life.
Burr know?
Aaron Burr knew most everyone, especially the good-looking young women. Good-looking young women. And because Dolly had been married, and but her husband had passed away, and so she was eligible once again with son in hand, son Payne. Anyway, the result of that was, however, that by 1800, in order to get Mr. Jefferson elected to be President of the United States, we needed to balance the ticket, so to speak. And so we needed a northerner. It was also impossible for me to run with Mr. Jefferson because, according to the Constitution, the president and vice presidential candidates of each, well, at that time we did not have official parties, certainly not recognized by the Constitution, but the vice presidential candidate may not be of the same state as the president. And that, I believe, continues to be the case, if I'm not mistaken. But in that particular instance, Aaron Burr of New York was offered the likelihood of bringing the votes of New York City and therefore potentially New York State into the Democratic-Republican column, and so he was placed on the ticket. The problem was all the electors that were supporting Mr. Jefferson voted for him for president, and then every one of them voted for Mr. Burr for vice president. And the way the Constitution was written, and I didn't have a part in that, it was to be whoever got the most electoral votes would be president, and whoever got the second number of votes would be vice president. If nobody got a majority, it was to be decided by the House of Representatives, which is indeed what happened. And they went through, I believe, 30-some votes
So we came close to having a President Aaron Burr instead of President Jefferson.
Yes, which was not the arrangement that was originally set up. Everyone understood that it was supposed to be President Jefferson and Vice President Burr, except maybe for Aaron Burr.
Are you suggesting that Mr. Burr didn't receive the memo?
Well, it must have gone astray. And anyway, what happened in the long term is that finally, and some people rumor this to be Mr. Hamilton, who at one time was a good friend of mine and later became well, we were, I suppose you'd say, good enemies after a while, but we were certainly on opposite sides of many issues in the Washington administration. But the fact was that it's been rumored that Mr. Hamilton used his influence because he seemed to hate Mr. Burr even more than he hated Mr. Jefferson, and encouraged a few of the New York delegation to switch their vote in the House of Representatives from Mr. Burr to Mr. Jefferson, and therefore a majority was created to end that particular controversy. Now, I say there were 30 votes taken. Several of them were taken on a given day, and so the election actually ranged over about 4 or 5 days. But it was quite a period of time of interest and excitement in the country.
No doubt. We're going to change just a little bit to today, which is 1810.
Yes, sir.
And you've been in office now since, for approximately 18 months, I guess it is. Because you were elected as president in the fall of 1808?
Yes, sir.
And inaugurated
on March 4th, 1809. Yes, sir.
And at this point in your term, have you been in consultation with former President Jefferson?
Well, we maintain a good correspondence, but you have to understand that the distance between Washington City and Monticello is a good deal greater than the 2 blocks that existed between my house on F Street and the President's mansion during the time he was president. And so we're not able to converse as freely. And then understandably, Mr. Jefferson at this point has the feeling that he has served his time as president, which I would have to say, while I tended to enjoy that time, I have a feeling it was not his favorite period of his life. There were many, many problems, of course, with Britain that we were viewed somewhat suspiciously, and with France that we hoped would be somewhat friendly, but with Mr. Napoleon you never know.
My question